An agreement that takes Brexit negotiations to the next stage. It's progress, but has Britain had to bow to the demands of the EU? And what does that mean for the crucial next round, the trade talks? This is Roundtable with me, Juliette Mann. "18 months with nothing agreed, and then at last consensus on some aspects of the divorce settlement, Britain's exit fee, the Irish border and the rights of citizens. But is Britain in a strong enough position going into phase 2? Can it get the trade deal it wants with the EU?
The Irish border, EU citizens' rights and a hefty divorce bill. Obstacles that appeared destined to derail any progress in the Brexit talks. Dismissed seemingly overnight.
Getting to this point has required give and take on both sides.
Today's result is, of course, a compromise.
But was this shrewd bargaining from the British Prime Minister or a capitulation? And is the UK ready for the next stage of the negotiations? Progress, but the deal is far from watertight.
Let me be clear, we still have a lot of work to do. The joint report is not the withdrawal agreement.
A deal Chief UK negotiator David Davis describes as a statement of intent, more than a legally enforceable thing. The divorce bill attached would see the UK pay nearly €40 billion towards its previous EU commitments. Theresa May has ruled out the return to a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and a transitional arrangement would see the UK adhering to the entirety of EU law for a period of 2 years after leaving. EU officials are now expected to recommend starting Phase 2, the long-awaited trade negotiations. Negotiating the future trade relationship could be a struggle for the UK.
We all know that breaking up is hard, but breaking up and building a new relation is much harder.
The UK's critics say the government bent to EU demands during Phase 1. They will want to see a stronger approach taken during Phase 2. Among EU officials, there is talk of mounting international pressure to deny favourable treatment to the United Kingdom. And the British cabinet is divided on what the ideal future trade relationship looks like. For many, Theresa May has done the impossible, launching negotiations into Phase 2. Can Britain deliver the strong performance it needs to secure a workable trade relationship with its former EU partners?
Well, joining us from Belfast is Thomas Hennessey, Professor of Modern British and Irish History at Canterbury Christ Church University. At the round table, we have John Mills, the founder of Labour Leave, Joy Dico, a journalist at the Evening Standard, and Dr. Russell Foster, a fellow at King's College London, where he's researching Brexit and EU politics. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. So, has Theresa May done the impossible? What do you think, John Mills?
Well, I think that she did a good job. I think she's managed to unite people to an extent which didn't seem likely a week or two ago. But I think there are still considerable problems in the way of how we're going to get a trade deal that works, which isn't really just the Norway option, which everybody at the beginning said was the worst of all possible worlds, where we're controlled by the European Union but don't really have any say in the way it develops. So I think there are dangers that we're going to finish up in the wrong place. But there's still a lot of negotiations to go. We may be able to pull it off.
Well, I think they set themselves up for a fall when Theresa May decided to call an election. which suddenly put a huge amount of pressure on the negotiating timetable. You know, as we know, there are 2 years. It was all delayed for 3 months. October did not see sufficient progress. And so come December, she was so desperate to move on, and it's so necessary for us to move on to talk about the future relationship. We were under enough pressure that we did, in fact, agree to a number of things that were very far away from what had originally been set out.
So in a hurry, doing too much, too little, too late?
I'm not sure it's too little too late. I do actually think that the agreement has come out rather well, but I say that as a Remainer who suddenly sees regulatory alignment, extensive rights for EU citizens living in the UK, the Northern Ireland issue seeming to be solved. So when we say everybody's come together, it's the Remainers who are the most unhappy about the prospect of this, and that we've all just sort of said, oh, well, that's not as bad as we thought. But it's not, I don't think, what Theresa May had originally set out to do.
Do you think it's what Theresa May set out to do?
Well, obviously Theresa May wanted to remain in the EU, and she's gone for a Brexit for leave because that was the democratic decision of the British people. With the Brexit negotiations, let's not forget that we should be cautious of talking about a template and whether enough has been done so far. This is the first time in history that a country has voted to leave the EU. The closest analogy was Greenland in 1986 when they left, and that required a very different template to the one that we're seeing now. So we could talk about Norway-style deals, a Canada-style deal, but what we're going to end up getting is a Britain-style deal, which has no precedent and has never existed before. So we should be very cautious about saying it's too little too late, or the negotiations are moving too slowly, because this has never happened before.
You say it's a very different kind of deal to Canada, to Greenland. Was enough research done before they sat down at the negotiating table?
I don't think enough research could have been done. This is a monumental issue. This is going to dominate British politics for years to come, the sheer bureaucratic scale of leaving the European Union. And we must also remember that this is Britain, a family of 4 countries leaving, rather than, say, Spain or Hungary, which should simply be one constitutional government leaving. So not only is this a country leaving the EU, and the constitutional affairs there, we've also got the constitutional issues between the 4 member states of it. So it is more complicated for Britain to leave, but it's certainly not impossible to manage.
It's complicated. You yourself have been part of some complicated negotiations. Where do you see this going? How are you feeling about the way the negotiations have developed as they are?
Well, I think the key thing is we've only got till early 2019 before we're actually going to have a supposed deal. It's so complicated and it's so integrated, all the different sort of relationships that one has to disentangle. It's going to be very, very difficult in that time space to actually produce a comprehensive deal. It's more likely that we'll get a deal very similar to what we have now.
So maintaining the status quo. But in terms of Northern Ireland, though, will it continue to be a stumbling block? I
think Northern Ireland is the key. The whole premise of a deal absolutely rests on the idea that there'll be no hard border. So the British government has committed itself to engaging and making sure that whatever North-South cooperation there is at this moment will be continuing exactly after the withdrawal process has ended and there's a transitional deal. The problem with that is how much North-South cooperation is there? There is a belief in some sort of hard Brexit quarters that there's only a few things that are done across the border as outlined in the Belfast Agreement. But the question is, what if there's a considerable amount, effectively everything that happens now in EU-UK trading deals and exchange of services, etc., could be brought under North-South, and at that point we're tied into the single market and the customs union, because there's no way you can have a hard border or soft border if you're going to actually break those agreements and affect the Republic of Ireland and its place in the internal market. It's just impossible. I'm not sure this has been thought through on the British side significantly to actually work out this.
Do you think it's been thought through? Mr. Hennessey says it hasn't been thought through.
Well, I mean, I rather agree with him. I think what's happened here is that under pressure to try and get an agreement through last week, what's happened is that quite a big concession was made by the UK in Ireland. It's supposed to be if only other arrangements can't be put in place to make it work. But, you know, if that is there as the backstop, and we fall back on that backstop, which I think could happen, I think this could then shape the arrangements which might otherwise be possible on the single market and the customs union in a way which is going to leave a lot of people in the UK dissatisfied. They're not really leaving the EU at all. We're going to finish up in the same position as we've always been, but without having a seat at the decision-making table in the European Union, in the same sort of position as Norway is in, which is really worse than we were before we started the negotiations in the first place. So I think there are problems. I'm not saying there aren't solutions to these problems, but I think that we have set ourselves up in a difficult place as a result of what was decided on Northern Ireland and the border.
Well, in fact, a report from think tank Roundtable has come out saying that the UK is going to be worse off under almost all Brexit scenarios. What does this do for brand Britain, for the UK's reputation around the world, do you think, Joy?
Well, the reputation is already looking fairly weak in Europe, who are puzzled as to why we've chosen to leave, obviously an organisation that they get great benefits from as members. How we go and talk to the rest of the world now becomes very interesting, and how the world looks at us. Obviously, we are trying to cleave ourselves away from the EU, and we are then asking for kind of. We're opening negotiations, for example, with the US about trade. We haven't formally opened them, but the US have already said via its ambassador that talks are on the table. They have to see us as a stable, capable nation with a kind of clear set of rules, a definition of how we like to do business. And all that is going to be up in the air for certainly 2 years, I think, 3 years, while we continue these negotiations. We continue to have to change our position in relation to the EU to get to the end of these these negotiations. And so I would imagine there will be a significant sort of fall in direct investment for just a few years, and things may change 5-10 years ahead of us, but for now there's going to be a pause.
You mentioned strong and stable, which are words that we've all heard many times before. What do you think, Dr. Foster, in terms of Theresa May? Has she been humiliated here, or has she shown strength in getting to where we are?
Well, let's compare this to Theresa May's position a few months ago, when people on all sides of the political spectrum were stating that she was a weak and wobbly leader who was incapable of managing any sort of Brexit negotiation. And up until very recently, the prevailing consensus in the media was that we were heading towards a no deal, the hardest possible Brexit. Then all of a sudden, in the space of a week, we've reached a symbolic negotiation on the 3 most important sticking points in the deal between the UK and the EU. So only a month ago, we thought that we were going to crash out on the 29th of March 2019 and revert to World Trade Organization rules, which would have been a catastrophe for Britain. Now it looks like we're going to get a very soft Brexit. I agree that there's an awful lot to do in a very short space of time, but that's not to say that solutions can't be found.
And Thomas Hennessey, if Northern Ireland then was the final piece in the jigsaw puzzle to move Brexit talks on to the next phase, has enough been done for those trade talks to move ahead successfully? I
don't think so. I think we're in this position because Theresa May triggered Article 50 immediately after the general election, and that needn't have happened. And if it could have been triggered later, and then more preparation and more time and more research into exactly what all this involves could have been done. So we're being pushed into this position where we're negotiating at a fast rate with time running out very rapidly towards constructing the deal. And the whole premise of the relationship with the Republic of Ireland and the UK is that there will be some form of deal that comes out at the end that addresses the whole question of a soft border, that there'll be no infrastructure on the border. The fallback position then is that the UK will come up with special arrangements to deal with that. And then finally, if they can't strike a deal, it'll have to be full alignment. The problem with all of that is that's probably the position we'll end up in from the beginning. As you go down the road and actually tick these things off one by one, I predict we'll be in a position where we'll be actually mirroring the conditions of the single market and the customs union, although the fiction will be, or the legal position will be, we're outside it, but we'll be tied into actually mirroring this and saying this is an exercise in British sovereignty. But effectively, as some of your speakers have already said, We'll be tied into what's been constructed around the rules and regulations of the single market, but we have absolutely no say over how those rules and regulations are formulated.
Joanna Dico, speaking to business leaders, the British Chamber of Commerce, they say they want this next phase, this transition to trade talks to be done and dusted by Q1. It's very timely. Are we under a time crunch here? Do you feel that there's a danger that the wrong deal will be made because time is running out?
Well, actually, I think they had probably said to 10 Downing Street they wanted them completed by Q4 last year. What they're saying publicly now is obviously giving her a little bit of breathing space. The problem is you get things like financial services, banks, for example. If they have to move to the EU or headquarter in the EU in order to carry on business, they actually have to have sorted out their offices, they have to do all sorts of cabling, licensing and so forth, and it takes months and months and years to sort that out. And so given that we are now down to, 15 months, if we end up with a hard Brexit all of a sudden and we go off this cliff edge, they've left it too late and they've not calculated their risk properly. That is why they are feeling very, very antsy at the moment. So, again, Theresa May, who is in fact listening to businesses, will begin to feel the pressure to in fact do a deal that suits them. The question then is whether the EU will allow it. And this is very specifically on financial services, where however much we talk about a Canada-style deal, there are no services in that deal whatsoever. So this really would be groundbreaking territory if we get in. So
Canada wouldn't work then for it's essentially a service-based economy. What kind of trade deal do you envisage, John Mills?
Well, I think that trade in goods isn't really a terribly serious problem. I think that it'd be really nice to have duty-free trade with Europe, but even if we finished up with WTO terms, the average tariff's only about 2.5%, so I don't think that would be a massive problem. Services are a much bigger issue, but I think we've got to be really careful that we just don't get the whole of the negotiations to hang on what happens to the city. I mean, the city is very important, but financial services are only about 10% of GDP, and to have the whole of the negotiations structured around what's done to save perhaps, I don't know, 10 or 15% at most of the business they do, which is with Europe, seems to me to be getting the things the wrong way round. I'm not saying we shouldn't try and look after financial services, of course we should, but I don't think they should be allowed to dominate the agenda to the extent to which some people would apparently like to see happen.
But financial services arguably the engine of growth for the UK economy.
Well, I think they bring in about 24 billion in surplus a year, so what we're doing is knocking out one of the few industries in which we're a big success in Europe. So there is a good reason to focus on it and try and get a deal.
Just say one thing, though, and that is we've got a massive, massive balance of payment surplus with deficit rather with the European Union, and this is something that is independent actually of the Brexit negotiations, but it's over £100 billion a year. Now, it does seem to me that this is something that's a really important element that ought to be drawn into the discussion, which at the moment just isn't happening at all. What we're actually doing is paying the European Union £100 billion a year just by borrowing the money in the first place to pay for them. We haven't
but as are Switzerland, as are Sweden, that's...
No, they've all got balance of payment surpluses. They're in a very different situation from what we are.
10 to 15% of our GDP is actually quite a significant amount of GDP. And you're talking about a situation in which weighing up when you're coming down to the nitty-gritty of how a deal will actually be finally ironed out, of jumping into the unknown, and the option is going with something that's similar to what you have now. And I think we saw in these negotiations up to last week that actually officials drive these negotiations, and ministers and the Prime Minister come in relatively late to these sorts of negotiations. It's left to officials on both sides to drive out the detail, and they effectively will be driving it. I've seen this in Northern Ireland with the negotiations in the peace process, that officials do a lot of the donkey work and stuff. Politicians have a whole range of other issues to be dealing with. And if you look at the performance that David Davis had recently on television and stuff, he looked to me like a man who was in shock at what was agreed, and there's a sense that he wasn't on top of his brief. So my reading would be that officials will bury away at this for the next few months, and we'll end up in a situation in which, when it comes down to the as Sir Alex Ferguson used to say, squeaky bum time, the deal will be more or less mirroring what we have now.
So would it be a case of maintaining the status quo, or are ministers and officials behind the scenes jumping into the unknown?
Well, for me, it comes back to the question of whether enough research was done prior to the Brexit referendum and then the invocation of Article 50. Let's take the Rand Corporation's recent report as an example. We've seen an awful lot of predictions and prognostication on what's going to happen to the British economy and the European economy during and after the process of withdrawal. But these amount to little more than speculation. A lot of predictions have been made even since David Cameron announced that there would be a referendum. One of those predictions was that a leave vote would lead to mass capital flight from Britain and large banks, large corporations moving to Frankfurt, Paris, New York. That hasn't happened. And as has been pointed out, the sheer scale of relocating companies to other cities makes it largely prohibitive. So there is a possibility that there will be an enormous negative impact upon financial services, but equally there's a possibility that they'll be able to weather the storm. So research couldn't be done on these things because there's never been an exit from the European Union. So the predictions that we're going to enter a land of milk and honey, or the predictions that we're going to collapse, are little more than speculation.
I would think, though, there's sort of mounting evidence that various banks are slowly moving people into EU financial centres. There isn't a sort of a moment at which it flips. However, at the point at which you actually have to headquarter within the EU in order to get passporting rights, 1,000 staff, another 1,000 staff, bank capitalisation in the EU rather than in the UK. And it's a very slow but steady kind of process because they can see stability there, whereas they can't see stability in here for the time being. That, again, is not to say it won't be here back in 10 years' time, but for the moment, that's the safe bet, and banks operate on risk and low risk.
I think the big question is whether this is really going to make any very substantial change to what would have happened anyway. I mean, if we're still effectively in the single market and we're in the customs union, then really the situation won't have altered very much from where we were before the Brexit vote. I think actually most people in this country would like to see a bigger shift than that, with more control being brought back to this country on various issues like how much we pay to the European Union, about immigration, about to the extent to which the single market regulations apply to companies that don't even trade with the European Union. I mean, I think this is really where the negotiations are going to focus on. And I don't think it's impossible to find a solution to these problems, but it's going to need some give and take on both sides.
Thomas Hennessey, do you think that the devil is in the detail?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Do you think the devil is in the detail? Do you think that that's what everyone wants to know, and the finer points of what the trade arrangements will be, and they want to know that now?
Well, I don't think the government has any idea what the finer points are going to be. Mrs May came out with a version of no deal is better than a bad deal, and I think when they actually look at this, and I think that was bluff. I think she is a Remainer. Our whole economic basis is tied into the European Union as it is now. And I think we will end up with something very similar. And I think the Irish border will be the crucial element in this. I think that is, if it comes down to the fact that there is a lot of north-south cooperation going on, that ties us to the single market and the customs union, and there's just no way around that.
No way around it? The north-south divide, the Northern Ireland being crucial?
Mm-hmm. Well, Northern Ireland is crucial. It's a curiosity of Northern Ireland that it both has this relationship through the Good Friday Agreement with the Republic of Ireland. A great peace was built on it. Tony Blair's reputation was built on it. And yet, Northern Ireland has to remain part of the UK. So if you begin to think of it as Venn diagrams, the Northern Ireland sits between the two. But the result of this latest phase of negotiations is that we've now taken in, that Venn diagram. Now all three sections of it all have to exist next to each other and run in alignment. Now it's going to get quite complicated at this point in time. Thomas was talking earlier about what cross-border agreements there already were. I think the agreement having happened, people are now quickly scurrying to try and find out to what extent this will affect the rest of the UK. I mean, it's conceivable in some interpretations, that the Common Agricultural Policy will continue to apply across the UK, which would somewhat curtail Michael Gove's activities as DEFRA. That's a judgment that will have to be made, in the coming months.
So sufficient progress, but it does sound like nothing is agreed until everything is agreed very quickly.
This is true, but we have to remember that with Brexit, it does have to happen. I was a Remainer. I still think that it's a bad idea to leave. But as much as we can talk about the Northern Irish border or financial services leaving the City of London, the Brexit vote in places like Exeter, Lincolnshire, Sunderland was not about economic transactions. It was about a sense of dissatisfaction, a sense of resentment of the status quo. And as much as there will be some economic pain in leaving the European Union, in time that pain will lessen. And what is important is that we will have preserved the spirit of democratic decisions.
Well, a big thank you to you, Dr. Russell Foster, Joy Dico, John Mills, and of course, Thomas Hennessey in Belfast. So a step in the right direction, perhaps for those wanting to move Brexit negotiations along. The final outcome, of course, will rest on the all-important trade deal. That was Roundtable. I'm Juliette Mann. Thanks for watching.